More of Data Analytics and Information Management, Week 2. Thought I'd show you a blank slide to begin with and talk just for a minute or two about the reasons for selecting this background. The kind of connecting lines to me represent a couple of things about data. The connection between points is obviously emblematic or symbolic of connecting information with data, with knowledge, with wisdom. Could be representative of what we will talk about a little bit later on, which is machine learning, advanced neural networks, represents sort of a decision tree, which is in data analytics, the use of information alternatives, and when a decision has to be made, yes or no, pro or con, there becomes a branch at certain points. So, to me, this made a nice background for the overall subject. And I hope its repeated use doesn't bore you, but it's actually fairly neutral too. So, with this week's readings and coming off of last week, I thought I would pose kind of a theoretical question. What if Abraham Lincoln had the internet? Now, you're sitting there probably asking, what does Abraham Lincoln have to do with DIKW? DIKW, as we know from this week's readings and our introduction last week, is kind of our shorthand for data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. Data being those bits, those fragments, those tiny little pieces, pixels, a last name, a first name, a reading on a weather chart. All these things represent data, and they pile up enormously, as we were teased last week. With information, substance starts to happen. Data can lead to information. It can become information. Maybe it's a fragment of information that with other fragments starts to become meaningful. Then comes knowledge. That's knowing something. It's something that we can use, something that represents something that gives us a basis for action possibly, or a basis for reaction. Knowledge. Wisdom, again, as I likened it last week, it's kind of like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Wisdom is at the top. It's what we all strive for. When we have wisdom, we can be a superior athlete, a brilliant coach. We can be Mozart. We can be John Lennon. We can be at the top of the game. Or we can be just pretty good at the game, too. There's no requirement that we be at the top to demonstrate wisdom. So, in one of the videos we heard from David Weinberger, and he made a little remark that I thought was pretty interesting. He said, "This is the greatest time in world history to be someone who cares about knowledge." What does he mean by that? I think he was talking about all the resources that we have, and we have endless, boundless access to information now. Nothing like Google ever existed until 17 or 18 years ago. Prior to that, there were search technologies. There were tools for finding things out on the internet. There was data in terms of what programs would gather and develop, stored in computers. There was data in, library card catalogs, frankly. So data did exist, but we didn't have quite the access we do today, not just through Google, but through other search technologies and frankly, the enterprises of the vast numbers of corporations and associations and individuals that populate our planet. Weinberger also said something interesting. It is also the greatest time in the world to be a complete idiot, meaning that just about anything can be, quote, substantiated or backed up or proven, and use the word proven with kind of quote marks around it, via information that's available on the internet. Any conspiracy theory, any misguided notion, not only is out there, but it can be quickly and rapidly disseminated. This week's readings materials kind of start off with a look at the data chain. And as you see here, and we see little connections between these things, kind of going with the metaphor of the slide, from processing a process that kind of begins with the collection of data, raw data, text, HTML code, something in a SQL database, XML, video. Remember, a single pixel is data. To the structure of the data, to the analysis of data from an exploratory analysis, to kind of more conceptual visualization or representation or reporting of the data through modeling algorithms, and then graphical displays, reports. All those things are the process of gathering, utilizing, analyzing, and communicating data. So we see the progression from left to right, various arrows, things circle back. It's a little confusing. Probably a bit easier to understand the DIKW notion with some simpler representations. And I go back to last week's pyramid as a point to kind of expand on. With data, as we saw in the last slide, we know we have vast quantities. One of the videos this week mentioned exabytes, stacking single sheets of newspaper from the Earth to the sun multiple times as a representation of the amount of data that is generated daily. There are a lot of different reports on the quantity of data that we generate, and you could probably make a pretty high stack just on the different theorists, different speakers, different professors who want to postulate about the quantities of data. So let's not dwell with that or dwell within that for too long. But there is an ever-growing body of information available to humanity, not only through data, but through the interpretation and the use of it to create information. We have increasing access to the information. But do we really have wisdom? One way of looking at data, I think, is just to look at it as tiny, almost microscopic bits that kind of form a larger body, a larger piece of light. Here's data represented a different way as sand or dirt. Virtually insignificant except for what can become of it. Here shown in kind of an amorphous way, winds shift sand, blow it, erosion takes its course. The dune will not look the same next year as it does today. Think of all the metaphorical terms and phrases that we use with regards to data. We talk about it in terms of flow. We talk about it as streams, data streams. We sometimes get exasperated and say things like, there are piles of data relating to this, or I have piles of data on this or on that. Information is something a little more substantial, right? As our reading, one of the readings for this week says, it's corpuscular, quantifiable, morselized, commoditized, objective, but information is always out there. In other words, data can become information, or information can result without data, frankly, as we know from the past. We process data, we access it, we try to expand it, we try to manipulate it. We do all sorts of things with information. Information isn't necessarily, though, knowledge. Knowledge is something entirely different. In other words, we can gather information and load ourselves up with information without really having knowledge. Conceptualizing knowledge, we do get it from data. In other words, data can produce knowledge. We get knowledge from the information that is produced from data, and sometimes we get knowledge from information produced without data. Is the process orderly? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Sometimes we intuit things and they become knowledge. Sometimes our knowledge changes based on new information. In other words, knowledge, like data itself or information itself, can also be rather amorphous. We can lose knowledge too. We forget things, things atrophy in our minds. So, knowledge is in flux as well. Is knowledge definable or quantifiable the way we understand data and information? Yes, but in a little bit different form. Remember, it's more substantial. Knowledge is what we seek, right? But what can we do with it? It's important here to look at two different types of knowledge, explicit and tacit. That was remarked upon in one of the two readings we had for this week. Explicit knowledge is something very substantial, something you can put a circle around. It's something generally that you can highlight. Explicit knowledge is a history lesson, a reading that we intake and know well enough to do well on a test. Explicit knowledge is somebody's last name. Did the Milwaukee Brewers win or lose last night? Who got traded in the NFL offseason? Who was gained in the NBA draft? That's all explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is a little bit different, right? Tacit knowledge is a feeling, it's something that you can develop over time. Tacit knowledge can be an appreciation for a sound or a tune that a composer uses later to build a symphony or just a nice song. Tacit knowledge is sometimes feelings or moods that become useful to us or destructive to us. So tacit knowledge is a little more fluid. It's a little more, I guess, sand-like. I'm not sure that's the right way to describe tacit knowledge, but it's not as hard, as easy to highlight, getting back to the original remark on this slide. Sand then becomes our metaphor for data. Looking a little further, we have data that becomes building blocks for information. Information itself can be represented as sort of a piece of a greater bit of knowledge, correct? Big knowledge does not necessarily come from more data or more information, though, does it? Remember the Stack Overflow example that was raised in the video this week. Stack Overflow, of course, being a resource for app developers and computer developers who are able to build on others' observations, others' questions, others' contribution to the stack. Imagine how much simpler the invention of things like, let's take the light bulb. Had there already been widely available information shared by others about different types of filament and how they might react to different gases and how they might carry currents and use those currents to illuminate. If all that had been available to Thomas Edison, he might have gotten to the light bulb a year or two earlier. Who knows how fast, or how much faster, rather, civilization could have been advanced back then by just that one invention coming a little quicker. Where does this leave us with wisdom? What is wisdom? Wisdom is, in my mind, the ability to apply all these things in ways that advance ideas and advance thinking, lead to new inventions, lead to new technologies even. So there's a bridge between knowledge and wisdom that isn't really a hard bridge, but is a gradual progress. I don't think people ever get to a point where they say, I have wisdom about this now. What do you think? Here's another metaphor for building with data and information. Kind of relates to what we looked at last week, the pyramid. So you can think of the sand at the base there as kind of the foundation. Now that we have data tools and access to data, data often becomes the foundation for information, which enables us to build further to knowledge and ultimately try to reach the peak of wisdom. Remember, though, some of the key points of this week's videos. Knowledge and data are coming at us faster and faster with greater velocity, but we are limited somewhat by our own minds. The human being can only process so much. Remember the example that was brought up about human interfaces haven't kept pace with computing and processing power, or the sheer volume of information that's available. There was the Necker cube example, shown to kind of demonstrate the way the human mind works. The eye and the brain work together to change our perception of that simple drawing. Back to my original question, though. Not done kind of gratuitously or spuriously, but sincerely, just to show the progress and the rate of change we've had, and think about the impact of data overall, the impact of information, the impact of the speed of it all and the volume of it all. What if Abraham Lincoln had the internet? Just imagine. He might have used it to favorably position the troops and outwit Southern generals even faster than they did. Actually, they didn't do it very quickly, did they? It took something like 4 years, 4 long, hard years. Perhaps he would have used it to negotiate in real time or an ongoing basis, not only with Southern leadership, but with members of Congress, governors throughout the northern and southern states. The communication would have perhaps sped understanding and facilitated a truce quicker. Who knows? It's possible. Remember, Lincoln was a very technology and science-oriented president for his time, and I'm sure he would have maximized the tools available. Imagine if he tweeted. I bet there would have been some doozies with that president as well. So we have better communication to outwit Southern generals, better contact and negotiation with the South. Perhaps he would have used it to form a broad understanding in 1861 that would have led to a legislative solution to the problem of slavery and other hot issues that were dividing the states, to avoid war altogether. One can only imagine, right? But that's where we are, and that's where we have to leave this thing. If you want, though, and want to explore this very question later, and see what the internet and our data tools can generate, you can always Google the question of the week. Until next week, and I promise that we're going to leave the history lesson alone in the future.